At high noon in Redemption Ridge, the screech of wagon wheels brought the main street to a halt. Dust rose thick in the air, and every gaze, curious, mocking, expectant, turned toward the carriage that stopped before the hotel. Jonah gripped the brim of his hat, heart pounding in anticipation. He believed today he would welcome Eleanor, the fair, soft-spoken bride promised to him by letter. But when the door swung open, it was Clara who stepped down, Eleanor's cousin, her skin dark as the earth itself, her eyes steady and unflinching. She bore grave news. The engagement was broken. And so, beneath a rain of whispers and disdain, Jonah and Clara found each other, daring to clasp hands and walk through the storm of judgment. Yet just as their feelings began to kindle, Eleanor returned without warning. On one side stood a vow inked on paper, on the other, a flame burning true in his chest. All of Redemption Ridge held its breath. Would Jonah cling to the old promise to preserve his honor, or risk everything to choose the love the town refused to bless? For with a single word, Jonah would decide not only his own fate, but hers. The wagon wheels screeched against the rutted dirt road, iron rims clattering as the sound carried down the narrow main street of Redemption Ridge. Dust rose with every turn of the wheels, blurring the noon sunlight. Faces appeared on either side, men pausing their hammers at the blacksmith shop, women setting down parcels at the general store, all eyes drawn to the carriage easing to a stop before the town's lone hotel. Jonah McCrae stood waiting, hand gripping the brim of his hat, chest heavy with anticipation. He had pictured this moment more times than he could count. So had the town, for word of Jonah's bride arriving from the faraway east had become the gossip of every porch and shop. A gentle schoolteacher, God-fearing and soft-spoken. That was how the letters had described her. The wagon came to a halt, the horses snorting and blowing hard, sweat streaking their necks. The driver leapt down and hurried to open the door, eyes fixed in silence. Jonah drew a deep breath, his fingers brushing the folded letter of betrothal tucked inside his vest pocket, its edges worn from being handled too often. Tonight, he told himself, he would no longer be alone. Tonight, the wooden porch he had built would welcome a woman. The carriage door swung wide. A figure emerged, framed by blinding light and swirling dust. But it was not Eleanor, the woman he had imagined, the one he had waited for. Instead stood a tall, slender shape, skin dark against the deep blue of her bonnet. Her black hair was neatly pinned, though stray wisps clung with dust, and her eyes, steady, unflinching, swept across the stunned crowd. She stepped down, skirts brushing the dirt, then straightened to her full height. The hush broke with scattered sighs of disappointment, whispers rustling through the street. Faces tightened, a few mouths curled with disdain. In Redemption Ridge, a black woman was rare enough, rarer still to appear as a promised bride. Jonah froze. His heart sank as though all the months of expectation had been emptied in an instant. He moved one step forward, voice rough. "Forgive me. You are—" The woman lifted her chin, dark eyes lit with an inner fire, unafraid, unwavering. Her voice rang clear. "I am Clara Whitmore, Eleanor's cousin." The name Eleanor struck like a blow. Jonah heard the murmur rise behind him. Clara went on without hesitation. "Eleanor fell ill just before departure. She cannot come to Montana. Her parents asked me to deliver their apology and to dissolve the betrothal." A long silence followed. Jonah thought he could hear the wind whistle through the gaps in the wooden storefronts. Inside his vest, the letter seemed to crumble to ash. The clean suit he had pressed, the small room he had readied, the dream of a hearth no longer cold, all of it fell to ruin. Clara turned slightly, motioning for the driver to set down several wooden trunks. "I came only to bring word," she said, "and to carry my own belongings. I am a seamstress. The cloth in these chests is all I own." The murmurs thickened. A few women whispered, voices dripping with pity and scorn. "A colored seamstress? Here?" Some men chuckled under their breath, casting Jonah sidelong looks to see what he would do. The whole town seemed caught between expectation and ridicule. Jonah stood rigid, yet his gaze lingered on Clara. Something in the way she held herself, in the tilt of her chin defying the stares, in the eyes that asked no pity. There was a quiet strength radiating from her, unlike the meek gentleness he had once imagined. His chest tightened with a feeling he could not name. Disappointment, yes, but something else, strange and unsettling. He could not look away. Clara endured the stares without lowering her face. Her fingers gripped her skirts, but her voice held firm. "I know my presence is unwelcome, but I have come all this way, and I mean to carve a place for myself. I ask no charity, only a chance to work." In that instant, Jonah felt all his careful plans, house furnishings, the thought of a wedding, fall away. Yet something new sparked within him. Clara was not the bride he had been promised, but there was fire in her eyes that drew him nonetheless. A cough broke from the far end of the street. Then a muttered voice. Jonah McCrae waited for a wife from the east, and all he got was a colored seamstress. Laughter snickered from a pair of young men perched on the smithy steps. Clara heard, but only turned her gaze on Jonah, steady, unyielding, a silent challenge. What would he do now? Jonah swallowed hard, fingers clenching the brim of his hat. Inside him yawned an emptiness, yet through it flickered an unexpected flame. He did not know its name. The town still watched. But Jonah alone felt it. Something had just changed forever. The image of Clara standing in the dust and sunlight, her proud eyes, her dark striking skin, remained etched deep in Jonah's mind. Yet even as whispers began to ripple across the main street, his thoughts drifted backward, to the days that had led him here, to the reason why he had prepared every detail for a marriage he believed would change his life forever. In the pocket of Jonah's coat still lay the betrothal letter, its creased edges worn thin from being folded too many times. It was the letter Pastor Williams had drafted after the families had exchanged correspondence. The name written there was Eleanor, a schoolteacher from the East, 26 years old, described as gentle, devout, practical, and capable of managing a household. It was those simple words that had persuaded Jonah. He had not been seeking romance or dreams too fragile to hold. What he wanted was a home, a companion, a steady peace. At 33, Jonah had lived more than half his years in solitude. He had left home young, hired on to cattle outfits, slept under endless skies with a saddle for his pillow, endured storms and faced down rustlers. When he had saved enough, he bought 300 acres on the edge of Redemption Ridge and, with sweat and calloused hands, built the Double M Ranch from the ground up. For 8 years, his life had been measured by work and the rhythm of the grazing seasons. But the more he built, the more he felt the emptiness. Each evening at supper, the hollow scrape of a spoon against a bowl was drowned out by the wind seeping through the cracks in the walls. Each morning, the barnyard rang with silence, the small room he had built waiting without a light in the window. Jonah knew the ranch needed a woman's hand, but more than that, his heart needed an anchor. So when Pastor Williams suggested a match with a schoolteacher from back east, Jonah had not hesitated long. The letters he exchanged with Eleanor contained no fiery declarations, only a few lines about her work, her faith, her hopes for a family. But their plainness convinced him. A woman who could read, teach, and live gently, that seemed to him the makings of a peaceful home. For weeks, Jonah prepared. He cleaned the main house, polished the oak table and chairs, and built an extra room off the porch for his bride. He even crafted a wooden shelf to hold the books she had promised to bring, volumes of poetry and the Holy Bible. On the porch, he hung a pinewood swing with his own hands, imagining she might sit there in the evenings reading as he worked the cattle yard. In town, word spread fast. Folks whispered that Jonah McCrae, the tight-lipped rancher, was finally taking a wife. Some laughed, wondering how a man so dry and plain would handle a woman in his home. Others grew curious, eager to glimpse the face of the bride from the east. Jonah paid no mind. He kept his eyes on the future he was building, quiet, steady, secure. The morning the carriage was due, Jonah rose early. He washed in cold well water, shaved until his skin burned raw, and chose the new white shirt he had bought, the one with pearl buttons that caught the light. It was the most costly thing he had ever purchased, for he usually wore only thick work shirts and worn leather trousers. But today was different. Today he must look the part of a worthy husband. He saddled his gray gelding, the horse that had carried him through so many seasons, and rode across the withered prairie grass. In his breast pocket, the betrothal letter pressed against his heart, each beat reminding him that loneliness was near its end. He pictured Eleanor, perhaps fair hair, perhaps gentle eyes, perhaps a soft-spoken voice. He did not need to know more. A wife who would tend the home, who would stand at his side. That was all he required. As the dirt road into town came into view, Jonah felt a nervous stirring he had not known in years, the anticipation of someone to meet. He imagined the carriage drawing to a halt, the woman stepping down, his greeting offered with a firm nod, and the ride back to his ranch where he would show her each room, each acre of soil. A simple beginning, but a lasting one. But all those expectations, the pressed vest, the fresh-built room, the pinewood swing, the carefully laid plans, turned to dust the moment the carriage door opened. It was not Eleanor, the gentle woman of his letters, but Clara Whitmore, her cousin, with skin dark as soil and eyes fierce with pride. Jonah stood, struck still. The letter in his pocket seemed to weigh like stone. Every plan he had made crumbled in an instant. Yet in the same breath, his heart throbbed with something unfamiliar, a sharp, unsettling beat that even he could not name. News traveled faster than prairie wind. From the moment the carriage left Main Street, Redemption Ridge was already buzzing. By evening, Jonah McCrae's failed wedding had become the talk of every corner, from Frank Harris's saloon to the Palmer's general store. Everyone had something to add, as though each had witnessed it firsthand. The man who waited for a bride from the east, only to be handed her cousin. And not just any cousin, a black woman. Fate surely mocked him. He stood there like a statue, didn't know whether to bolt or tip his hat. Laughter rang, half mocking, half pitying. In the saloon, drunks pounded mugs and turned Jonah's lost bride into a bawdy refrain. At the general store, two merchant wives whispered just loudly enough to be overheard. We thought he'd bring home a sweet school teacher. Turns out, he got a wandering seamstress. How shameful. Jonah heard snatches of it when passing by, but he stayed silent. He was not a man given to quarrel. Still, the weight of the townsfolk's eyes pressed on him. Not direct stares, but sideways glances, crooked smirks, nods that seemed to claim they knew his life better than he did. Never had Jonah felt so examined. As for Clara, she had understood the moment her boots touched Main Street. She had stepped into a storm of scrutiny. The stares weren't only because she had come in Eleanor's place, but because of the color of her skin. In a town where nearly every face was white, and from the east, the sight of a black woman, independent, unbowed, and unashamed, was a flame set against dry grass. That afternoon, Clara rented a small room on the second floor of the Rodriguez Hotel. When the driver set her trunks in the hallway, she knelt, opening each one, smoothing the folded cloth within. Bolts of silk, rolls of French lace, steel scissors glinting, all that she owned in the world. Her fingers lingered on the fabrics, as if steadying her breath amid the chaos. Yet the murmurs seeped through the window. Children playing in the street shouted, "Jonah's lost bride is here!" then burst into cruel laughter. Clara closed her eyes and drew her breath slow. She had endured such stares back east, where a self-sufficient black woman was an oddity. Out here, the difference seemed only sharper. That evening in the Rodriguez dining room, she sat quietly at a corner table. A bowl of soup before her, she ate as the din rolled on. At a nearby table, men laughed over their plates. "If I were Jonah, I'd have ridden out of town. What a disgrace." Another added, "Maybe he needs needles and thread more than he needs a teacher." The laughter swelled. Clara did not turn, but her hand tightened on the spoon until her knuckles blanched. Jonah entered just then. He saw her sitting alone, saw the eyes digging into her back. He wanted to cross to her at once, but his boots felt leaden. Not because he was ashamed of her, no, it was because he knew each step would be measured, each word twisted into fresh gossip. Jonah had never cared for rumor, yet this time it grated. Still, he moved to her table, his voice low, steady. "Is your supper to your liking?" Clara looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Enough to keep me for tomorrow." Whispers flared again. Someone snickered loud enough for all to hear. "There now, a pair already." Jonah heard it clear, but did not answer. He only sat beside Clara, a silent claim that she was not alone. Afterward, they left the tavern in silence. The street was dim, lantern light spilling from a few windows. Clara spoke softly, almost to herself. "I'm not blind to what they think, but I won't leave. I came here to work, and I will." Jonah turned, catching her gaze in the dark. It was not the look of someone begging pity. It was a challenge, aimed at the whole town. He had no words, only a slow nod. In the days that followed, the rumors did not die. At the smithy, young men laughed loud, betting how long before Jonah sent the cousin packing. At church, women leaned close, whispering, "What nerve she has, thinking she can teach our children." Some pitied Jonah as though he were the victim of a cruel joke. Jonah never responded, but each time he walked by, his back grew stiff. He had never feared silence, but now it cut like a dull knife, scraping at his pride. Clara, instead of hiding, carried bolts of cloth down to the hotel window, spreading them in the sun. She sat there with needle and thread in hand, unmoved by the stares. Some scoffed, but a few women slowed, eyes lingering on the fine fabrics. Curiosity began to glimmer. Jonah saw it. One afternoon across the street, he caught sight of Clara kneeling to measure the shoulders of a little girl, the gatekeeper's child. The girl giggled as Clara teased her, while her mother stood shy but hesitant. Jonah realized then, whatever the town whispered, Clara was carving her place with her own hands, with skill and pride unbending. And strangely, that gave Jonah a measure of faith, not only in her, but in the thought that perhaps her arrival was not a curse. Yet Redemption Ridge was never a town quick to welcome difference, and rumor, once rooted, had a way of clinging, trailing after Jonah and Clara as relentless as the wind over the prairie. Rumor was like wind, unseen, but everywhere heard. Jonah had always borne silence well, yet this time he knew silence would not serve. The thought circled him like a restless horse. If he did nothing, Clara would be swallowed by malicious tongues, and he himself would be the town's laughingstock. So one late afternoon, he did what his reticent nature rarely allowed. He asked Clara to supper. "To explain," he said, finding her by the hotel window, where she laid fabric out to catch the light, needle pinned in her cushion. His voice was rough as the earth of his ranch. Clara looked up, dark eyes widening slightly. "Explain to whom?" she asked. "To the whole town," Jonah answered, then added softer, "and to ourselves." Clara was silent for a beat. The last sunlight struck her skin, bronzing it against the weathered boards of the hotel. At last, she gave a small nod. "Very well, but I don't want that meal to be pity served on a plate." "It won't be," Jonah said firmly. "Only a decent supper." The Rodriguez family's dining room glowed with oil lamps that evening. The air was heavy with stew and buttered bread. Tables were pressed close, every seat filled, for word that Jonah McCrae and the colored cousin would dine together had spread like fire through dry grass. Jonah drew out Clara's chair, a simple gesture, yet in the eyes of the room it was a public claim. Clara heard the murmurs rise but held her head high, gaze steady. The meal began with awkward pleasantries, but gradually the tension ebbed. Jonah asked about her trade, about the path that had carried her from the Far East to Montana. Clara spoke briefly, of apprenticing in a Boston shop, of saving every coin to purchase imported French cloth, of once planning to open her own store in Chicago, only to be carried farther west by circumstance. "You weren't afraid?" Jonah asked, his voice half wonder, half respect. "Traveling alone? Coming to a place this wild?" Clara gave a small laugh. "If I'd let fear rule me, I'd have nothing left. I chose to step forward, because I would not spend life sewing to the orders of others. Here, they may laugh, but at least here, I belong to myself." Jonah studied her across the table. Admiration stirred within him, strange and unexpected. He had thought all he wanted was a quiet, yielding woman, yet the one before him, bright-eyed, steady-voiced, felt right. When the roasted meat was served, Jonah spoke at last, slow and deliberate. "On Main Street there's an empty house. Belonged to a milliner, left last year. If you wish, you could rent it for a shop. It's not a poor spot. Good light, close to the church." Clara set down her knife, eyes widening. "You Mean that? I've only just arrived. Nothing holds me yet. Aren't you afraid I'll leave in a few months? Jonah shook his head. If leaving was in you, you'd not be sitting here, among stares and whispers. I believe anyone who stands tall in the wind doesn't fall easy. For a moment, Clara could not answer. Her chest swelled with feelings unnamed. All her life she'd heard scorn, too independent, too different, not knowing her place. Yet here, in the most unlikely corner of the world, a man looked at her and saw not burden, but flame. Then yes, she said softly, like a vow. I'll try. Redemption Ridge will have to grow used to a new dress shop. Jonah nodded, the corner of his mouth bending into a rare smile. For the first time in years, joy came not from work accomplished, but from the presence of another soul. But the fragile warmth shattered with the creak of the door. A gust of cold air swept in, followed by a broad-shouldered figure. A dust-stained coat hung from him, hat brim low, boots striking the boards with deliberate weight. When he raised his head, the lamplight revealed his face. Luke Barrett. The room hushed. Barrett was no stranger to Redemption Ridge. He had once tried to buy a slice of Jonah's land, had a reputation for circling families on the edge of ruin. Folks feared him, despised him, but few dared stand against him. That night, Barrett strode straight to the counter, ordered whiskey, and sat. Yet his gaze was not hidden. It fixed on Jonah and Clara's table. He drank, lips curling faintly. Clara felt it at once. It was not the town's scorn she saw in his eyes, but something else, measuring, possessive, as though she were nothing but a rare prize brought to auction. A chill ran down her spine, though she kept her back unbowed. Jonah saw it too. His hand clenched beneath the table, veins taut across his knuckles. No words passed, but the air grew heavy. Whispers slithered through the room. Barrett's got his eye on her. This'll mean trouble. Clara steadied herself, folding her napkin with quiet precision. She lifted her chin, meeting Jonah's gaze. His eyes held calm, but underneath burned resolve. Don't fear. I won't let him touch you. The meal went on, though the taste soured with the knowledge of danger. They spoke a little more, but both knew their minds lingered at the far corner where Barrett's gaze clung, cold and unyielding. When they left the tavern, the night air was cool, but Jonah's blood roiled. He did not fear gossip, nor stares. But Barrett was not like the rest. When he set his sights on something, he rarely let go. And tonight, he had marked Clara. She walked beside him, skirts whispering in the breeze. Passing the church steps, she murmured, "You saw it, didn't you? The way he looked." Jonah stopped, met her eyes squarely. "I saw, and I won't let him near you." In the wavering lamplight, Clara glimpsed something in Jonah's gaze, more than protection. It was the flicker of a new bond taking shape, warm, dangerous, undeniable. Sunday morning draped Redemption Ridge in stillness. The toll of the church bell rolled across the prairie, echoing into the wide sky. Townsfolk, dressed in their best, gathered at the steps of the plain white chapel. Jonah slipped into the last pew, wearing a worn but clean vest, his hat laid neatly at his side. He was not one for church-going, but today, part for the sake of appearances and part because he knew Clara would be there, he came. Clara sat apart, not blending with the crowd. Her dark blue dress was modest, her hair tied back in a neat bun, yet her gaze still drew lingering glances. The sidelong stares, the whispered needles pricked at her. But Clara sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, face calm. Pastor Williams began the sermon. He spoke of faith and trial, his voice gravelly yet steady. Jonah listened halfway, his mind drifting. By chance, he turned, his eyes meeting Clara's across the pews. She looked back. The moment was brief, but it struck his chest with a harder beat. Suddenly, pounding hooves shattered the solemn air. From the road outside, a young rider burst forth, face flushed, shirt soaked in sweat. His voice cracked with terror as he shouted, "The Wilkins farm's on fire! The family's trapped inside the granary!" The church jolted into chaos. Gasps, scraping benches, the sermon halted mid-phrase. Jonah sprang to his feet. Without hesitation, he snatched his hat and rushed out the door. Other men followed close behind. Clara rose too. A few women reached for her arm. "Not your place, it's too dangerous!" But Clara shook them off. Her heart pounded, memories of her days as a nurse during the epidemic back east flooding back. She knew the smell of smoke, the sound of cries, the weight of conscience if she stood idle. Gathering her skirts, she ran after the men. Jonah swung onto his gray gelding and drove it hard from town. The wind tore past his ears, dirt flying up in clouds. When he glanced back, he caught a glimpse of Clara running beside a wagon, her dress streaked with dust, her face showing no fear. The sight struck him with sudden awe. The road to the Wilkins place was but a few miles, yet felt endless. From afar, a column of black smoke rose, the stench of burning biting their throats. When they arrived, the sight froze them. The Wilkins granary roared in flames. Fire licked high along the wooden roof. Beams cracked and thundered as they gave way. Mrs. Wilkins's scream tore across the yard. "My babies! Dear God, save my babies!" Jonah wasted no time. He stripped his coat, soaked a kerchief, and plunged into the knot of men straining at the side door. The wood jammed tight, smoke billowing out. He braced his shoulder, drove forward with all his strength. The door burst wide, black smoke pouring. Inside, children coughed and cried, faces smeared with soot. Jonah and two others snatched them up and carried them out. Cheers rose as the little ones fell into their mother's arms, but word came sharp. "Wilkins and the boy are still inside. Back corner." Jonah turned without hesitation. Wrapping the wet cloth over his face, he charged back into the inferno. The heat seared his skin, smoke clawed at his eyes. He staggered, following the faint groan ahead. At last he found them. Wilkins pinned beneath a fallen beam, the eldest boy choking, trying to pull him free. Jonah dropped, heaved with all his might, the beam lifting. The boy dragged his father out, Jonah steadying both as they stumbled toward the light. Outside, Clara did not stand idle. On her knees in the dirt, she tore her dress hem for bandages, poured water from a bucket over scorched skin. When the children were carried out, she rushed to them, her voice calm, her hands swift and sure. For a moment, the townsfolk forgot the color of her skin, seeing only the skill of a healer. At last, Jonah staggered through the smoke, hair singed, face blackened, hands blistered. Clara abandoned everything and ran to him. Her heart clenched as she saw him sway. "You could have died," she cried, anger and fear trembling together. Jonah's breath rasped, his ash-gray eyes fixed on hers. "And so could you," he answered low, voice raw from smoke. "But neither of us chose to stand still." In that instant, amid ash and cries, chaos and terror, An invisible bond tightened between them. Clara felt her heart quake, not only from fear, but from something deeper, harder to name. Even as they stood there, a man rushed up, clutching a charred scrap of cloth that reeked of oil. His voice rang out. "This was set. Someone lit it on purpose." The crowd erupted. Whispers flared, names flew, and soon all tongues pointed to one familiar name: Barrett. Rumor, once sparked, spread like prairie fire. And this time, the blaze threatened not only the Wilkins barn, but the fragile peace Jonah and Clara had just begun to find. Smoke hung thick across the sky like a gray shroud. The stench of burning wood mingled with the crackling roar of the collapsing granary roof. And everyone knew, each passing moment meant the difference between life and death. Jonah staggered out of the flames, his shirt singed at the shoulders, both hands raw and blistered. Sweat and soot streamed down his face, his eyes blurred by smoke. He still held fast to the Wilkins boy, while two others carried the father whose leg had been crushed. They burst free just as a violent explosion split the air and the roof caved in, swallowing the space they had barely escaped. The crowd surged toward them, cries and shouts tangled together. Mrs. Wilkins clutched her children, tears streaking her soot-smeared face. "Thank God! Thank God my babies are alive!" Clara dropped to her knees beside them, her hands trembling yet steady with purpose. She tore strips from her dress, binding the burns of a child. She fetched water from a bucket passed hand to hand, lifted the wounded toward fresher air. No one commanded her, yet the townsfolk obeyed her voice, trusting her swift, sure movements. When Jonah finally released the boy and sank to the ground, gasping, Clara rushed to him. She seized his arm, seeing the blistered flesh, the trembling fingers. Fear gripped her throat like iron. "You could have died!" she burst out, voice shaking with anger and relief, eyes glistening with tears. Jonah met her gaze, his ash-gray eyes rimmed with smoke, his voice hoarse. "And so could you," he rasped. "But we did not stand still." The simple words rocked Clara to her core. Amid the chaos, only the two of them seemed to hear each other. The man the town had always called cold, unfeeling. He had spoken something that pierced straight through her heart. She drew a long breath, steadied herself, and pulled him toward clearer air. "Sit. I need to see to your burns." Without waiting for protest, she dipped cloth in cool water and pressed it to his hands. Jonah gritted his teeth but made no sound. Around them, the scene churned with panic. Some men carried water to stamp out sparks spreading into the dry grass. Women hushed crying children. And in that turmoil, Clara's figure stood out. Her gown torn, sleeves stained with blood and ash, yet her posture firm, her hands unwavering. For the first time, many townsfolk forgot to whisper about her skin. They saw only a woman who gave herself as wholly as any of them. Jonah looked at her, sweat streaking her brow, smoke tangled in her hair, and thought, perhaps God had brought Clara here at the very moment this town needed her most. A sudden cry split the crowd. "It was set! Someone lit this fire!" A man held up a charred scrap of cloth, reeking of oil. The crowd roared, voices scattering like startled birds. "Barrett! Must have been him!" Didn't he threaten Wilkins before? The name Barrett spread again, this time heavy as a curse. The flames could be beaten down, but Barrett's shadow now lay across Redemption Ridge like a warning. Jonah narrowed his eyes at the burned cloth. He said nothing, but a grim weight pressed in his chest. Barrett had sat in the tavern the night before, his gaze fixed on Clara. And now a deliberate fire, endangering the whole community. Coincidence? Jonah did not believe it. Clara heard as well. She shivered faintly, tightening the bandage around Jonah's hand. If it was him, it's worse than I thought. Don't speak it yet, Jonah answered, voice low, rough. They'll need proof, not suspicion. For a moment they were silent. Only the cries of children and the snap of burning beams filled the air. At last, the flames died to smoldering ruin, leaving blackened wreckage where the granary had stood. Smoke drifted, heavy and bitter. Yet among the ashes, something else stirred, an undeniable bond between Jonah and Clara. When the last embers were stamped out, Pastor Williams laid a hand on Jonah's shoulder, his voice solemn. You saved lives today, and so did Miss Whitmore. He turned to Clara, his gaze earnest. God bless your courage. Clara lowered her eyes, unaccustomed to praise, but she felt it, the townsfolk watching her with something different. No longer only contempt or suspicion, but a dawning respect, though edged with surprise. On the road back, Jonah slowed so Clara could walk beside him. They were silent until Clara whispered, You shouldn't risk yourself like that. Jonah turned, a faint smile tugging his lips. Should I have stood aside? That's not how I live, Clara. Her mouth tightened, then softened. She murmured, almost to herself, It's not how I live either. They said no more, but in that silence, a tacit truth took root. From this day on, through fire and ash, they both knew they were cut from the same cloth, the kind who would never stand still. Weeks after the Wilkins fire, Redemption Ridge still carried the scent of smoke. The new granary was yet to rise, but townsfolk already spoke of rebuilding it stronger, with better timber. Around every campfire, the names Jonah and Clara came up, his daring rescue, her steadfast care. For the first time, the town had ceased its whispering scorn, replacing it with a silence harder to read, as though they weren't ready to accept, yet could no longer deny. Jonah felt lighter, a man of few words. He didn't need to say it. Everyone saw him and Clara together more often. Outside her new shop with the sign Whitmore and Company dressmaking freshly hung, or at gatherings to aid the Wilkins family. Things, it seemed, were moving in the right direction. Until one afternoon, when a carriage rolled slowly into town and changed everything. The wheels groaned over gravel, raising a cloud of red dust. The driver reined in before the hotel. The door swung open, and down stepped none other than Eleanor Bennett, the long-promised bride, returned after convalescence. Her ash-gray dress clung to a frame thinner than before, her skin pale from illness, but her delicate face still bore its gentle grace. At her side stood her parents, the Bennetts, faces set with grim resolve, as though this journey were to reclaim the honor they believed had been lost. A ripple of murmurs swept the street. She's the one, the real bride. So the cousin was only standing in? What will Jonah do now? Jonah, standing near the church with Pastor Williams, caught the stir and turned. Eleanor smiled faintly when she saw him, and that smile carried the memory of their letters, the hopes he once harbored. Yet now, he felt only the weight of trouble ahead. Inside her shop, Clara heard the commotion and pulled back the curtain. The sight of Eleanor, in her gray dress, clenched her chest. Memories of that first carriage arrival came flooding back, when she had stepped down instead of Eleanor, into the shock and the whispers. Now, with Eleanor's return, it was as if the burden doubled. By nightfall, the town boiled like a kettle. At the general store, Whispers spread that Clara had stolen her cousin's betrothed. At the saloon, men made coarse jokes, their eyes following Clara with cruel interest. She was never more than a stand-in, one wealthy wife sneered while buying sugar. And now she's clung on, opening a shop besides, ambition plain as day. Clara heard the words, but kept her spine straight, her steps steady. Still, inside, the wound deepened. Eleanor did not feed the talk, yet her mere presence, gentle, refined, her white skin such a contrast to Clara, was enough to stoke comparisons. Sympathetic looks turned toward Eleanor only sharpened Clara's isolation. That evening, in her shop, Clara sat by the oil lamp, fingers trembling against fabric. She knew she had done no wrong, yet the gnawing sense of being an intruder, a usurper in a story never meant for her, weighed heavy. Eleanor's gray figure haunted her, mingled with the sting of gossip. Jonah came to her that night. He knocked, and the lamplight through the crack showed Clara's pale face. "Clara," he said softly when she opened the door, "I know this weighs on you, but you must hear me." She turned away, her voice breaking. "Eleanor is the woman you were promised. I was only her replacement, Jonah. Don't you know what they're saying? They call me the thief who stole her betrothed." Jonah stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. His blue-gray eyes held steady. "I cannot marry Eleanor. Not because she isn't good, but because I don't love her. Everything I've built, this home, this ranch, this life, I want to share with you." Clara turned, tears bright in her eyes. "You don't understand. She's come all this way, endured illness, crossed miles for you. If I stay, she bears the shame. I can't do that to Eleanor. I can't." Jonah stepped closer, his scarred hand closing over hers. "I know you care for her, but you must know this too. I have the right to choose my life, and I've chosen already." Clara trembled, torn between belief and fear. Outside, the town's whispers grew louder, poisonous as ever. Yet here, in this small room, heavy with cloth and thread, Jonah's voice carried a truth no rumor could erase. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at church with her parents. The whole town gathered, eager for the next act of the drama. Then Jonah entered, with Clara at his side. He strode to the wooden pulpit, his voice ringing strong. "The woman I choose is not Eleanor. The woman I love is Clara Whitmore." The room froze. Only the wind whistled faintly through the cracks. Eleanor bowed her head, her face drained white, her parents struck silent. Clara, eyes glistening, lifted her gaze to Jonah. Never had she seen him so resolute, nor felt her heart ache and blaze at once. In that silence, what Jonah had carried quietly for so long became declaration. And from that moment, there would be no turning back. After the night, Jonah declared before the town that he chose Clara, not Eleanor. Redemption Ridge erupted in whispers. The news spread like wildfire in dry wind. At the saloon, at the general store, even in the churchyard, tongues wagged. Curious glances, sly smirks, half-jesting words all turned sharp as arrows whenever Clara walked past. She heard it all, though none said it to her face. She had grown used to suspicion since the day she stepped down from that carriage. A black woman in the place of a promised bride. But now, with Eleanor truly present, the whispers cut deeper, heavier. She stole her cousin's betrothed. 5 words, sharp enough to carve wounds that would not heal. Each morning, Clara still opened her shop, hung the sign Whitmore and Company dressmaking over the porch. She laid out her fabrics, threaded her needles, tried to hold her composure, yet her hands trembled as she folded cloth. Sometimes customers came only to pry, to dig for news of Jonah. They cared nothing for dresses. They wanted stories to spread. Clara answered politely, sparingly, while her heart clenched tighter with every word. She began to avoid Jonah. At the sound of his horse's hooves outside, she quietly drew the door shut, pretending busyness. At the market, if she caught sight of him, she took another path. Part of her longed to be near him, yet another part feared it. Feared facing Eleanor. Feared being the reason another woman suffered shame. One late afternoon, Jonah came to the shop. Sunlight poured through the glass, casting its glow across Clara's face. She looked up and saw him there. Tall frame, hat in hand, eyes steady and unyielding. Her heart jolted, and she turned quickly, fussing with bolts of fabric to hide her turmoil. "Clara," Jonah said, his voice rough and low. "We need to talk." She bit her lip, shook her head. "There's nothing to say." Jonah stepped inside, shutting the door, shutting out the clamor of the street. The room smelled of new cloth, lit with the soft gold of late afternoon. The space between them seemed to close, leaving Clara nowhere to hide. Her eyes brimmed as she turned back to him. "You don't understand. Eleanor, she's endured sickness. She's crossed 1,000 miles to fulfill the vow our families arranged. And me? I was only a replacement. Someone who stepped into a place not mine." Her voice cracked, words heavy as stones. "If I stay, I'll be the cause of her disgrace. I can't do that to her. I can't." The tears she had held back for weeks finally spilled, tracing her cheeks. Clara covered her face, shoulders shaking. Jonah stepped closer, not touching yet, watching her break with his own chest twisting. Then his voice came, slow and firm. "Clara, I cannot marry Eleanor." Her head jerked up, startled. "What did you say?" His eyes burned with the same resolve he had shown in firelight. "I cannot marry Eleanor. Not because she isn't worthy. She is kind, gentle, good. But between us, there is no love. Do you understand? I cannot force my heart into silence for the rest of my life." Clara shook her head, tears still falling. "But love isn't everything. You'll wound her. You'll turn the whole town against you." Jonah sighed softly, then laid his scarred, blistered hand over hers. "I've lived with the town's rejection before. They once saw me as nothing but a loner on a barren ranch. They laughed when I failed in my early seasons. But I endured, and I will endure again, so long as you stand with me." Clara searched his eyes, and in them she saw no fleeting promise, but the truth of a man shaped by hardship, who knew exactly what he wanted and who he needed. "You don't understand," she whispered faintly. "I'm afraid. Afraid of always being branded the thief of another woman's happiness. Afraid I'll never belong." Jonah gripped her hand tighter, his voice unwavering. "I do understand. But I also know this: no one but you makes me feel alive. Not Eleanor. Not anyone. Only you, Clara." For a long moment, Clara stood frozen. The town's noise faded. The world shrank to the rhythm of two hearts beating in unison inside the fabric-scented room. She lowered her hand from her face, her eyes still wet but softened now. "Jonah," He leaned closer, not rushing, only enough for her to see each sunmark, each scar left from fire and toil. I will not walk away. Even if the whole town turns against us, I will still be here, with you. A breath shuddered from Clara, as though she had laid down a burden too long carried. She spoke no further, only let her hand remain within his. Outside, the rumors still stirred, but within that small shop, Clara knew. The war inside her had found its answer, not in what the town believed, not in duty to Eleanor, but in the steady truth of Jonah's eyes. And for the first time since Eleanor's return, Clara stopped running. In the days after Jonah stood before the crowd and declared his choice, Redemption Ridge did not quiet. If anything, the storm of talk grew fiercer. What once had been hushed doubts was now open gossip, turning Jonah and Clara into the town's only subject. At the saloon, cowboys banged mugs on the tables and jeered, "That colored woman, she's got Jonah McCrae's heart." Raucous laughter followed, without restraint. At the general store, wives muttered when Clara passed. Bold enough, after stealing her cousin's betrothed. Jonah's stubborn as a mule, but how long can she stand against this town's eyes? Clara heard every word. Each step along Main Street was like walking between blades. Yet she did not bow her head. Her dark eyes stared straight ahead, proud as if to say, "They may whisper, but they cannot choose her life for her." That morning, the air was still cool, pale sunlight washing over gray rooftops. Clara stood before her shop, hanging a freshly painted sign, Whitmore & Co. Dressmaking. The gold letters on dark wood gleamed like a declaration. This was not just a shop, it was a claim. She would root herself here, no matter the scandal. Two wealthy wives, known for wagging tongues, happened by. They paused, gazed at the sign, then at Clara. One curled her lip and said, dripping scorn, "Bold indeed, to open a shop here after stealing your cousin's fiancé." The words dropped like stones. Others on the street turned to see what she would do. Clara froze a moment, her hand still gripping the cord of the sign. But instead of lowering her head, she lifted it, eyes steady. Her voice was calm, clear. "This shop is open to anyone who needs a dress. I believe every woman deserves to feel beautiful and strong, no matter what's said." No one expected such an answer. Not excuse, not anger, only quiet resolve. The two wives stiffened, sniffed, and swept away. But those nearby, the shop girl, the blacksmith, a cluster of children, watched Clara with new eyes. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows onto bolts of cloth in every hue. Clara laid her hands over the fabric, feeling its smoothness, its familiarity. This was her world, where her hands and skill were free. Here she would prove her worth lay not in her skin, nor in gossip, but in every stitch she made. By noon, her first customer stepped in. Mrs. Rodriguez, matron of the town's busiest eatery, a strong woman with a frank manner, long a friend to Jonah. She looked around the shop, then smiled. "My daughter's to be married come spring. I'd rather not go all the way to Helena for a gown. If you can manage it, I'll place my order here." Clara blinked, startled, then nodded softly. "I'll do my very best." Mrs. Rodriguez set a hand on her shoulder, her gaze warm. "Let their talk fall away. They'll change once they see what you can do." The words landed like a warm wind, softening the chill that had clung to Clara's heart. But the town was not so quick to change. That afternoon, carrying cloth to the storeroom, Clara overheard two young women whispering outside. "They say Jonah's bewitched." What white man would ever? The voice faltered, uneasy with its own words. But I think she's beautiful, strong in her way. And Jonah looks truly happy. Clara stood still. Half the words were knives, but half were shoots breaking soil. The town had not accepted her, not yet, but cracks had begun to split the stone. At dusk, as Clara locked the shop, she saw Jonah waiting at the far end of the street. He leaned on the rail, hat in hand, eyes fixed on her. Clearly, word of the morning's confrontation had reached him. He walked closer, a rare smile tugging his lips. I heard you answered them steady. Clara exhaled. I won't make myself a fool by quarreling. But sometimes, it feels like I fight alone. Jonah set his hand on her shoulder, gentle, firm. You're not alone. You have me. And soon enough they'll see. The work you do will force them to look different. Clara said nothing, but in the fading light, her dark eyes met his gray blue, and the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken truth. That night, Clara sat in her shop, oil lamp casting glow over scattered fabric. Needle and thread flashed as she worked tirelessly, stitching her faith into every seam, that someday the town would not remember her as the thief of a betrothal, but as the woman who brought something new to Redemption Ridge. Outside, whispers still circled like restless wind, but inside, each stroke of her needle beat steady as a drum, quiet but unyielding. That evening, as the sun cast its gold across the prairie, Jonah opened the gates of the McCrae ranch and welcomed families inside. His invitation had surprised many. Some wives whispered, some husbands frowned, yet curiosity and respect for the man who had saved the Wilkins family from the fire brought most of them there. The yard had been cleared, long tables built from rough planks set end to end, covered with plain white cloth. Wildflowers were placed along the center, their simple fragrance drifting on the evening wind. Over an open fire, beef sizzled and smoked, the scent mingling with dry grass. No whiskey was served, only cool lemonade and a few bottles of home-brewed beer. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. No earrings, no necklace, only her steady gaze and calm bearing. She moved along the tables, greeting each guest. Some responded warmly, others gave only a curt nod. But Clara's smile remained, quiet and proud, betraying no unease. It was the children who broke the tension first. They ran about the yard, laughing, before settling eagerly for food. Watching them, Clara's heart softened. The children knew nothing of whispers, nor cared. They saw her only as a woman with a kind smile and bright fabrics in her hands. When the meal began, the air was still tentative. Utensils clinked softly, voices scattered. All seemed to wait for Jonah to speak, and he did, rising with his glass in hand. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice low and steady. I know Redemption Ridge has spoken much of late. About me. About Clara. The yard fell silent. Some lowered their eyes. Others fixed theirs on Clara, weighing her. Jonah went on. I want to say this once, here before you all. Clara is not only the woman I love. She has brought Redemption Ridge a new voice, a change long overdue. It was she who proposed classes for your daughters, that they too might learn to read and reckon, as your sons do. The blacksmith paused, his fork in midair. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, remembering Clara teaching her daughter letters with a scrap of chalk and a board. Jonah's tone firmed. This town has long thought women fit only for kitchens and sewing needles. But Clara believes they deserve more. And I agree. She has begun teaching, freely, despite all the whispers against her. A ripple of quiet spread through the tables. Eyes once guarded, heavy with prejudice, now began to waver. Clara did not rise to defend herself, nor add a word. She only sat, hands clasped lightly, her expression calm and steady, as though her actions had spoken louder than anything she could say. Slowly, the meal warmed. Children chattered, laughter sparked, conversation drifted to cattle prices, harvests, and the coming winter. Glances at Clara now carried not only judgment, but a hint of thoughtfulness. Mrs. Johnson, wife of the banker, and known for her pride, was the first to speak. After a long silence, she said, "My daughter tells me you taught her sums. She came home and tallied the market money for me. I never thought I'd see such a thing." Clara smiled gently, replying simply, "I only believe a daughter should learn to own for herself, too." Mrs. Johnson gave a slow nod, her gaze softening. Quiet murmurs stirred across the tables. Then Mr. Wilkins, leaning on his crutch, spoke, voice hoarse but resolute. "Without Jonah, my family would have burned. Without Clara, my boys' burns would be worse than scars. I owe them both. I don't care what promises were once made. I'm only grateful." The yard hushed. His words cut through the gossip like a blade. People looked at one another, then at Clara, not with curiosity now, but with the beginnings of respect. The gathering stretched until the sunset painted the sky in red. Children dozed against their mothers, while laughter echoed through the yard. Clara sat quietly, her heart swelling with something strange and warm. For the first time since stepping from that carriage, she felt Redemption Ridge might truly open its doors to her. As guests drifted home, Jonah stood on the porch, watching Clara gather plates. He saw the weariness in her slight shoulders, but also the light in her eyes, the light of a woman who had crossed a threshold. He stepped close, laying his hand over hers. "You don't need to speak much. Just be yourself. They'll see soon enough." Clara looked up, her dark eyes gleaming beneath the fading light. "I don't want to be the shadow of gossip. I want them to see me for who I am." Jonah smiled faintly. "They've begun already, and they'll see more. You've planted the seed. Someday, the town will know it was you who brought new fire to Redemption Ridge." Clara said nothing, but her heart trembled. She understood, in that moment, that it was not arguments nor sharp words that would change them. It was action, small classes, bandaged burns, stitches in cloth, that would make them see. That night, when the lamps dimmed, Clara sat on the porch beneath a sky filled with stars. Crickets sang, smoke lingered in the breeze. Her heart was still, yet hopeful. Redemption Ridge would whisper yet, would doubt yet. But tonight, she had seen it. Wary eyes had turned, if only slightly, toward respect. It was a beginning, and Clara knew she would not turn back. There was no doubt anymore. After storms of whispers, after scornful glances and wagging tongues, Jonah and Clara chose to announce their betrothal. It was no longer a private promise between two souls, but a public declaration before all of Redemption Ridge. They had chosen each other, no matter the gossip. The wedding was simple, held on the wooden porch of the McCrae ranch, on an early October day when autumn's gold stretched across the prairie. The hillside behind the house blazed with red and yellow maples, while the wind carried the faint scent of straw smoke. No decorated church, no organ music, only the vast sky and open land as backdrop, and a small community slowly learning to open its heart. Clara wore a plain white dress, sewn from scraps of fabric she had carried on her first journey west. Cloth once mocked as unfit for a dowry, once dust-stained from the road, now bore witness to her endurance and her hands' skill. The dress was not grand, not ornate, yet perfectly fitted, glowing with the pride of a woman who had fought for her own happiness. Jonah wore a white shirt, dark trousers, and an old but well-kept vest. No ornament save the pocket watch of his father, the only relic he had kept from youth. Yet his sunburned face and the steady blue of his eyes when they met Clara's outshone everything else. Friends and neighbors gathered, standing in a circle around the porch. Some had once doubted, some had once mocked, yet they came, drawn by the quiet need to witness this moment. The instant a small town turned a page, because two people had dared to step through rumor into truth. The ceremony began with old Pastor Williams. He carried no heavy Bible, only a small notebook of notes. His voice, rough yet strong, carried on the wind. Today we gather not in a church, but on the porch of a home. For marriage does not begin only in prayers within four walls. It begins in the hearth, where two will live, endure, and build together. Jonah and Clara, you stand before God and this community to declare that you choose one another, in love, in trial, in light, and in shadow. Clara stood by Jonah, their hands entwined, her eyes blurred with tears, but her lips pressed firm against trembling. Jonah gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his silent vow not to let go. The pastor motioned Jonah to speak first. Jonah lifted his head, his voice hoarse yet clear. I, Jonah McCrae, choose Clara Whitmore not as a replacement, but as the woman I found amid dust and scorn. I vow to stand with you, whether under burning sun or storming rain, whether through cruel gossip or days of peace. I vow you will never face the world alone, for from this day we are one. A murmur rose, then fell into silence. Clara turned to him, tears glistening, but her smile shone radiant. Then her turn. Clara's voice, soft yet unwavering, fell into the stillness like iron into fire. I, Clara Whitmore, choose Jonah McCrae, not because he was the only man who reached for me, but because he saw me, believed in me, even when the town turned its back. I vow never to let the fire in my voice be quenched, but to use it to warm this home, to guide us, and to light the way for our children to come. A gust of wind stirred, rustling the golden leaves like the applause of nature itself. Among the crowd, some bowed their heads, some brushed at their eyes. Pastor Williams smiled, his voice warm. By the love you have sworn and the witness of this community, I declare you husband and wife. You may share your first kiss. Jonah bent and touched his lips to Clara's. It was not long, not fierce, but it was steady. A kiss of certainty. The kiss of two who had once been alone, now bound as home to one another. Afterward, a small feast began. No band, only Miguel, the Mexican hand from the ranch, playing a fiddle tune, a simple waltz. Children danced, grown folk laughed. On the tables lay humble dishes, stew, cornbread, warm apple pie. Each family had brought something, making it a true community meal. Clara walked among blessings and handshakes, sensing the change in the air. Some might not yet accept her fully, but today, instead of barbed whispers, she received nods, hand clasps, even smiles. Jonah stayed close, eyes following her every step. He knew it was Clara's strength, her fire, that had begun to shift the town, and he promised himself he would share the weight of every gaze, every storm, so she would never carry it alone again. As night fell, lanterns were strung along the porch, their golden glow spilling warm across the yard. Jonah and Clara sat side by side, watching friends dance on the packed earth. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I'd live to see a day like this." Jonah smiled, squeezing her hand. "Nor I. But we've come through it all. And this is only the beginning." On the wide prairie night, the two sat steady, like a small flame burning against the autumn wind. That night, Redemption Ridge was no longer just a quiet town. It had witnessed a wedding, simple, yet strong enough to shift its course. And on the wooden porch, Jonah and Clara began a new journey, not just as two caught in rumor's tide, but as husband and wife, as home, as the beginning of a legacy. 5 years passed like the blink of an eye. Another autumn morning lay across the Montana prairie, but the wooden porch of Jonah McCrae's home was no longer quiet, as it once had been. Children's footsteps rang out, bright and unruly, across the yard. 3 little ones, fiery-haired as if born of flame itself, a boy of 8, another of 6, and a girl just 4, ran circles around the old maple at the porch, their laughter clear and sharp enough to wake all of Redemption Ridge from its slumber. Clara leaned against the doorway, her dark curls tucked with a sprig of wild daisy. Weariness traced faint lines across her face, yet her eyes glowed as she watched her children play. Dust still clung to her dress from the night before. She had worked late, finishing a wedding gown for the blacksmith's daughter. However busy, she had never abandoned her habit of sewing for those who needed it most. Farm girls with little coin, but dreams of walking to the altar in a dress that felt like hope. Redemption Ridge of 5 years ago had been little more than gray timber houses, a modest church, and a scattering of shops. Now the town had changed. At the head of Main Street stood a new brick building. Its first school open to both girls and boys. Each morning, the chant of spelling drifted out its windows, proof that change had taken root. Across the road, the women's circle met every Thursday. Clara, along with Mrs. Rodriguez and Martha, the pastor's wife, led the group. They spoke not only of sewing or supper, but held readings, invited lecturers from Helena to speak on health, education, even land rights. What had once been mocked now stood as the town's pride. New homes dotted the hillside, smoke curling steady from chimneys, showing that more families had come to settle. Folks said, "This town is steady because of the fire in one woman's voice." And no one called Clara the stand-in anymore. She was Mrs. McCrae, or more simply, Miss Clara, the one who always stepped forward when the community needed her. Jonah sat on the porch steps, sharpening a knife while his eyes lingered on his children. His hair now held threads of gray, but his blue eyes were as sure as ever. Sometimes he thought back to the man he had been 5 years ago, 33, hungry for a quiet home, hoping only for a gentle wife. But heaven had not sent him a silent wind. Instead, it had sent him a flame that refused to be extinguished. Clara had not only stepped into his house, she had stepped into the heart of the town and changed it from the ground up. Jonah knew it was her defiance of rumor, her spine held straight beneath scornful eyes that made him feel alive again. He loved her not only for the tenderness hidden in her gaze, but for the strength she carried, the strength that had warmed not just him, but the whole of Redemption Ridge. One afternoon, Clara was pressed to speak at the opening of the new school. Mrs. Rodriguez nudged her forward, though her cheeks flushed. Children sat on long benches, wide-eyed at the woman in a dark blue dress, threads still clinging to her hands. Clara drew a breath, her voice not loud, but clear and unwavering. 5 years ago, when I first stepped into this town, I was seen as an outsider, someone who did not belong. But I believed every soul has a place, so long as they are willing to root themselves and tend the soil. So will you. Learn your letters, learn your numbers, for knowledge is a thing no one can steal from you. And never forget your voice has worth, no matter who tells you otherwise. In the crowd, some fathers and mothers sat quietly, eyes shining. They remembered the jeers Clara once faced, and now they knew without her, there would be no school here. That night, after the children slept, Clara and Jonah sat on the porch swing. Above them, stars blazed, and the wind carried the first bite of winter. Clara leaned against Jonah's shoulder, her voice soft but eased. Do you remember, years ago, you said all you wanted was a gentle, quiet wife? Jonah chuckled, pressing a kiss into her hair. I remember, and I was wrong. I never needed a quiet breeze. I needed a fire. You are that fire, Clara. She said nothing, only squeezed his calloused hand, her thoughts drifting through all they had endured, scornful looks, harsh words, and now children's laughter ringing bright across their yard. Every moment stood as proof. She had chosen the right road. One winter morning, snow lay heavy on rooftops, the town hushed beneath its white blanket. Clara stepped onto the porch, a shawl she had knitted wrapped about her. The youngest girl ran out, clung to her leg, her blue eyes the mirror of Jonah's. Clara lifted her daughter and whispered, My girl, never fear their words. Stand tall. You are of my blood, and in that blood shines a fire. No one heard but the gray sky. Yet that whisper was the legacy Clara wished to leave, not of wealth nor reputation, but of courage and belief. 5 years after a wedding simple as autumn leaves, Redemption Ridge had become a town full of life. And at the heart of that change stood the woman once dismissed, once branded the replacement. Now, when folks spoke her name, they said, She is the one who keeps the fire in this town. Jonah had once thought happiness meant finding a meek wife for a quiet life. But heaven gave him a woman aflame. And it was that fire that warmed not only his family, but all of Redemption Ridge. At any age, we come to realize this truth. Real happiness is not found in avoiding gossip, but in daring to live true to our hearts. Clara chose to stand tall in the storm. Jonah chose to love despite every whisper, and together their choices became a beautiful story in the unforgiving land of the Wild West. Dear friends, if this story has brought you a bit of warmth, or reminded you of the brave choices in your own life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so together we can keep the fire alive for these Wild West love stories, where love and faith will always find their way home.